There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human consciousness that Alan Watts observed with penetrating clarity throughout his teachings. When someone genuinely wakes up to the nature of reality, when they stop playing the games that most people consider essential to life, something strange happens in their social environment. The people around them don't celebrate this transformation. They don't throw parties or offer congratulations. Instead, something darker emerges from the shadows of collective consciousness, a deep, often unacknowledged envy, mixed with resentment, confusion, and even hostility. This isn't the kind of envy we feel toward someone who wins the lottery or buys a fancy car. This is something far more primal and threatening. It's the envy that arises when someone discovers a freedom we didn't know was possible, when they stop participating in the shared anxiety that binds our culture together like invisible chains. Watts understood that spiritual awakening doesn't happen in a vacuum. We are social creatures, and our identities are woven into the fabric of our relationships, our communities, our shared assumptions about what life is supposed to be. When one thread in this fabric suddenly changes color, when one person stops vibrating at the frequency of collective fear and desire, the entire tapestry feels the disturbance, the liberation that threatens. Imagine someone in your life, perhaps a colleague, a family member, or a friend, who suddenly stops worrying about the things that consume everyone else's attention. They're no longer anxious about their social status, no longer desperate for approval, no longer caught in the hamster wheel of comparison and competition. They haven't become cold or detached. In fact, they seem more alive, more present, more genuinely engaged with life than ever before. But there's something different about their energy. They've stopped playing the game. Alan Watts spent much of his life exploring what happens when consciousness recognizes its true nature, when the separate self we take ourselves to be is seen through as an elaborate fiction, a thought structure with no more inherent reality than a character in a novel. This recognition doesn't make you special or superior. It doesn't grant you magical powers or secret knowledge. What it does is far more radical. It removes the fundamental anxiety that drives almost all human behavior. This is where the trouble begins. Our entire social structure is built on shared anxiety. We bond over our worries, our complaints, our struggles to achieve and maintain and protect. We create elaborate systems of meaning based on the premise that we are separate, vulnerable entities in a hostile or indifferent universe, and that our primary task is to secure our position, defend our interests, and prove our worth. When someone genuinely awakens from this dream, not intellectually, not as a belief system, but as a lived reality, they stop participating in these binding rituals of anxiety. They don't do this through effort or discipline. They simply no longer experience the separation that makes these rituals necessary. And this non-participation, however gentle and non-judgmental it may be, acts like a mirror that reflects back to everyone else the prison they're still living in. The psychology of existential envy. Watts often spoke about the ego's fundamental insecurity, the fact that the separate self we think we are is actually a fiction maintained through constant effort. The ego is like a tightrope walker who must keep moving to stay balanced. It survives through comparison, through the endless process of measuring itself against others, against ideals, against the imagined judgments of society. When you encounter someone who has genuinely let go of this exhausting performance, something fascinating happens in your own psyche. At first, you might feel drawn to them. There's something refreshing about their presence, something easeful and natural. But if you're still deeply identified with your own ego structure, if you're still grinding away in the mill of self-improvement and status-seeking, another feeling begins to emerge underneath the attraction. This feeling is complex and often deeply buried. It's not simple jealousy over something they have that you want. It's more like the envy a prisoner might feel towards someone who casually walks through the prison walls as if they weren't there. Not because they broke out through force or cunning, but because they simply realized the walls were never solid to begin with. This realization threatens everything. If this person has found a freedom that doesn't depend on achieving, acquiring, or becoming something different than they are, then what about all your own efforts? What about the years you've spent trying to improve yourself, make yourself more acceptable, more successful, more secure? What about the carefully constructed identity you've built and defended? The awakened person's very existence poses an uncomfortable question. What if all this striving is unnecessary? What if the freedom and peace we seek through endless effort is actually obscured by that very effort? The mask of normalcy. Alan Watts had a brilliant way of describing how society maintains its collective trance. He compared it to a mutual agreement to pretend that our roles are who we really are, that our thoughts define us, that the chattering narrative in our heads is the voice of truth rather than a biological process, no different than digestion. Most people never question this agreement. They're born into it, raised within it, and spend their entire lives elaborating on it. The rules of the game are absorbed so deeply that they become invisible, like water to a fish. You learn what to want, what to fear, what to work toward, what defines success and failure, worthiness and shame. The deeply awake person, through no fault or virtue of their own, has seen through this mutual pretending. They haven't rejected society or become antisocial. They simply recognize the game as a game. They can play when appropriate, but they're no longer fooled. They're no longer at stake in the outcome. This recognition transforms everything about how they move through the world. There's a lightness about them, a humor, a lack of defensiveness. They're not trying to convince anyone of anything, including their own awakening. They're not building a spiritual identity to replace their old identity. They've simply stopped taking the whole drama quite so seriously. And this, paradoxically, is exactly what makes others uncomfortable, the threat of authenticity. Watts often emphasized that spiritual awakening isn't about becoming someone special or achieving some extraordinary state. It's about recognizing what has always been true, that you are, in your deepest nature, the eternal consciousness playing at being a separate individual. The ocean pretending to be a wave, the universe experiencing itself from a particular point of view. When this recognition stabilizes, not as an intellectual concept, but as lived experience, a person naturally begins to express more authenticity. They say what they mean. They don't twist themselves into shapes to please others. They don't perform enthusiasm they don't feel or hide emotions that are present. This doesn't make them rude or inconsiderate. In fact, they often become more genuinely kind because their kindness is no longer motivated by a need for approval. But this authenticity, this refusal to participate in the elaborate social dance of pretense, creates ripples of discomfort. Others begin to feel their own inauthenticity more acutely in this person's presence. The masks we all wear become more obvious, more uncomfortable. The act of maintaining appearances becomes more exhausting. The awakened person isn't doing anything to cause this. They're simply being natural, which makes everyone else's unnaturalness more apparent. It's like sitting in a room where everyone has agreed to ignore an elephant in the corner, and suddenly one person casually mentions it. They're not trying to make anyone uncomfortable. They've simply stopped pretending the elephant isn't there. The envy beneath the surface. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the specific quality of envy that arises in the presence of genuine awakening. This isn't the straightforward envy of wanting what someone else has. It's more subtle and more disturbing. The envy operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, there's envy of the freedom the awakened person embodies. the freedom from anxiety, from the need to prove themselves, from the endless mental commentary that most people experience as the background noise of consciousness. This is a freedom that can't be bought, earned, or achieved through conventional means, which makes it particularly frustrating. On another level, there's envy of their apparent contentment without the things we've been told are necessary for happiness. They're not striving towards some future salvation. They're not accumulating achievements or possessions to fill an inner void. They seem complete without needing to complete themselves, and this violates the basic economic principle upon which our entire society is built, the principle of lack, of never having enough, of always needing more. But perhaps the deepest level of envy is directed at something even more fundamental, their courage to be different. Because even though the awakened person isn't trying to be different, they're simply being natural. Their naturalness stands in stark contrast to the conformity that most people have accepted as inevitable. Most of us, if we're honest, know on some level that we're living according to programs we didn't choose, pursuing goals we don't really care about, maintaining relationships based on mutual pretense rather than genuine connection. We know it, but we feel powerless to change it. We've invested too much in the system. We have too much to lose. The sunk cost is too high. Then along comes someone who has somehow managed to step outside the system without suffering the consequences we've been taught to fear. They're not rich, not famous, not particularly accomplished by conventional standards, yet they possess something we desperately want, but don't know how to attain: peace with what is. The mechanism of projection. Alan Watts was deeply influenced by Eastern psychology, particularly the Buddhist and Hindu understanding of how the mind creates and maintains the illusion of separation. One of the key mechanisms in this process is projection, the tendency to see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. When we encounter someone who embodies qualities we've disowned or possibilities we've rejected, we often project our own denied potential onto them and then resent them for having what we think we can't have. This is a defense mechanism that protects the ego from having to confront its own self-imposed limitations. The person who has awakened to their true nature becomes a screen for these projections. Others might see them as arrogant for not participating in collective anxiety. They might interpret their peace as indifference, their lack of ambition as laziness, their authenticity as selfishness. These projections say nothing about the awakened person and everything about the inner conflict in those doing the projecting. Watts understood that we live in a culture that has a deeply ambivalent relationship with freedom. We claim to value it, but we're also terrified of it. True freedom, the freedom to be fully ourselves without seeking permission or validation, is actually discouraged in subtle and not so subtle ways. We're taught to color within the lines, to follow the script, to want what we're supposed to want. When someone breaks free of these constraints, when they discover the vast space of being that exists prior to all our cultural conditioning, they become living proof that the constraints were never absolute. They reveal that the prison we're living in has always had an open door, and this revelation can provoke intense discomfort in those who aren't ready to walk through that door themselves. The social cost of awakening. One of the aspects of spiritual awakening that Watts discussed candidly, though it's often glossed over in more popular treatments of the subject, is the social isolation it can create. Not because the awakened person withdraws from society, but because society often withdraws from them. Old friendships may fade when they're based on shared complaints and commiserations that no longer resonate. Family members may feel confused or even betrayed when you stop playing the roles they've assigned to you. Colleagues may find your lack of competitive drive suspicious or threatening. Romantic partners may feel destabilized when you're no longer seeking completion through the relationship. This isn't because awakening makes you cold or disconnected. In fact, the opposite is true. You're capable of more genuine connection than ever before because you're no longer relating from behind a defensive ego structure, but genuine connection requires that the other person also be willing to drop their defenses, and most people aren't ready for that level of vulnerability. The deeply awake person often finds themselves in a strange position, surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone in their understanding. They can't go back to the consensus trance, but they're not separate from it either. They see through the game, but must continue to live in a world where almost everyone else is still taking it completely seriously. Watts himself experienced this throughout his life. Despite his popularity as a speaker and writer, despite his ability to communicate profound truths with clarity and humor, he often spoke about the loneliness of his position, neither fully within the mainstream culture nor completely removed from it, straddling worlds with understanding that couldn't be easily shared. The response of the sleeper. When confronted with someone who has awakened, people typically respond in predictable ways. These responses form a spectrum from subtle discomfort to outright hostility, and understanding them helps illuminate the dynamics we're exploring. Some people respond with fascination and attraction. They sense something different about the awakened person and want to be around them, hoping perhaps that whatever they have might be contagious. But this fascination often contains an element of objectification, treating the awakened person as a resource to be extracted rather than a human being to be related to. Others respond with dismissal. They explain away the person's peace and contentment as naivety, privilege, or self-deception. They just don't understand how the real world works, they say, or wait until real problems hit them. This dismissal protects the ego from having to question its own assumptions. Still others respond with subtle or overt hostility. They may mock the person's perspectives, challenge them unnecessarily, or try to provoke them into reactive behavior that would prove they're not really as awakened as they seem. This is the envy expressing itself most directly, the unconscious impulse to pull the person back down into the shared trance to prove that their freedom is an illusion. The burden of consciousness. Alan Watts had a phrase he used frequently when discussing spiritual awakening. You can't unsee what you've seen. Once consciousness recognizes its true nature, once the illusion of the separate self is penetrated, there's no going back to the innocent unconsciousness that preceded it. This is both liberation and burden, freedom and responsibility. The deeply awake person carries a strange kind of knowledge, not intellectual knowledge that can be argued about or proven, but direct experiential knowledge of reality's fundamental nature. They know, with the certainty of immediate experience, that the separate self everyone is so worried about protecting and promoting is a mental construct, useful for navigating practical life, but not ultimately real. This knowledge changes everything, yet from the outside, very little may appear to have changed. The awakened person still has a personality, still has preferences and opinions, still experiences pleasure and pain. But the relationship to all of these has fundamentally shifted. There's a witnessing awareness that doesn't get completely absorbed into whatever is happening. There's space around experience rather than identification with it. Living with this consciousness while surrounded by people who are completely identified with their mental narratives, their roles, their fears and desires, creates a peculiar isolation. It's not that the awakened person feels superior. That would be just another form of ego. It's more like being the only adult at a children's party. You can enjoy the games and appreciate the innocence, but you can't quite participate with the same wholehearted belief. The paradox of communication. One of the challenges Watts himself faced, and which he often addressed in his talks, is the fundamental difficulty of communicating awakening. Language is structured around duality, subject and object, self and other, this and that. But awakening is the recognition of non-duality, the seeing through of these apparently separate categories. How do you use dualistic language to point toward non-dual reality? How do you describe the absence of the separate self to someone who is utterly convinced they are a separate self? It's like trying to describe color to someone who has only ever seen black and white. Your words will be interpreted through their existing framework, which is precisely what needs to be transcended. The awakened person knows this intuitively. They recognize that most attempts to explain their experience will be misunderstood, misinterpreted, or dismissed. So they often learn to remain quiet about the deepest dimensions of their understanding. They speak the language of the consensus reality when necessary, while maintaining their inner freedom. But this very silence, this decision not to proselytize or explain, can be interpreted by others as arrogance or secretiveness. Why won't they share what they know? People wonder. Who do they think they are, holding back from us? The irony is that the awakened person is holding back precisely out of respect and compassion, recognizing that certain truths can't be transmitted through words, but must be discovered directly. Watts compared this to the Zen tradition of direct pointing, rather than elaborate explanation. The awakened person may use stories, metaphors, humor, or unexpected responses to create openings in others' consciousness, rather than trying to stuff insights into their heads. But these indirect methods are often less satisfying to the questioner than straightforward answers would be, creating another source of frustration and resentment. The envy of effortlessness. One of the most provocative aspects of genuine awakening, and one that triggers particularly intense envy, is the quality of effortlessness that emerges. The awakened person isn't trying to be spiritual. They're not following a practice or striving toward a goal. The very striving has been seen through and released. This effortlessness is infuriating to those who are still grinding away at their spiritual practice, still trying to achieve enlightenment, still working hard to become more conscious, more present, more awakened. They've been told that awakening requires tremendous effort, years of meditation, strict discipline, perhaps multiple lifetimes of practice. And here's someone who seems to embody the very freedom they're seeking, but without the apparent effort. What they don't understand, what Watts tried to communicate in dozens of different ways throughout his teachings, is that the effort itself is the obstacle. The seeking prevents the finding. The trying to become awakened is the activity of the ego that must be seen through for awakening to occur. Watts used the metaphor of trying to smooth water with an iron. The more you try, the more disturbance you create. Awakening happens not through effort, but through the cessation of the particular kind of effort that is the ego's attempt to improve itself. It's a relaxation, a letting go, a seeing that what you're seeking has always been here. But explaining this to someone who is deeply invested in their spiritual practice, who has built an entire identity around being a seeker, is nearly impossible. They hear laziness or passivity when you speak of effortlessness. They interpret the message as, don't do anything, when what you're actually pointing to is something far more subtle. Do what you do, live fully, engage completely, but without the underlying anxious self-referential quality that is the hallmark of the ego. The envy that arises here is particularly acute because it seems so unfair. I've been meditating for 20 years, someone might think, and this person who doesn't even have a practice seems more awake than I am. What they're missing is that their 20 years of practice may have been 20 years of reinforcing the seeker identity, the sense of a someone who needs to get somewhere rather than genuinely relaxing into what already is. The threat to power structures. Watts was particularly astute in recognizing how spiritual awakening challenges not just individual egos, but entire social and power structures. Our civilization is built on the premise of lack and the promise of future fulfillment. Buy this product and you'll be happy. Achieve this status and you'll be secure. Follow these rules and you'll be saved. The awakened person, by their very existence, undermines this entire system. They demonstrate that happiness isn't for sale, that security doesn't come from external circumstances, that you don't need to be saved because you were never actually in danger. This is tremendously threatening to the powers that profit from our sense of lack and inadequacy. This applies not just to commercial interests, but to religious institutions, educational systems, political structures. Any organization that derives its authority from promising to provide something people think they need. The awakened person doesn't need what these institutions are selling, because they've recognized that what they truly are already includes everything essential. The envy this triggers isn't always personal or individual. Sometimes it's institutional and systemic. The awakened person may find themselves subtly or overtly pushed out of organizations, communities, and systems that depend on maintaining people in a state of seeking and striving. They're not pushing back or rebelling. They've simply stopped participating in the underlying transaction, and this non-participation is correctly perceived as a threat. Watts himself experienced this. His unorthodox approach to spirituality, his refusal to maintain the guru role, his willingness to acknowledge his own humanity and flaws, all made him suspect to both religious institutions and academic establishments. He was too spiritual for academia and too intellectual and irreverent for religious orthodoxy. He existed in a liminal space that made conventional authorities uncomfortable. Navigating relationships after awakening. One of the practical challenges that arises after awakening is how to navigate existing relationships. Friends, family members, romantic partners, all of these people knew you one way, and now something fundamental has shifted. You haven't become a different person, but your relationship to personhood has changed. You're still playing the roles when appropriate, but you're no longer fooled by them. This shift can be deeply unsettling for those close to you. They may feel like they're losing you, even though you're still physically present. The emotional hooks that used to work don't work the same way. The buttons that could be pushed no longer trigger the same reactions. There's a stability and groundedness that wasn't there before, and while this might seem like it would be welcomed, it often creates anxiety instead. Romantic relationships can be particularly challenging. If the relationship was based on mutual need, two incomplete people seeking completion through each other, the awakening of one partner disrupts the entire dynamic. The awakened person is no longer seeking completion. They're complete in themselves, which paradoxically allows for much deeper and more authentic connection. But the other partner may experience this as abandonment or rejection. Family dynamics also shift. The roles assigned within family systems, the successful one, the rebellious one, the caretaker, the victim, no longer fit the same way. The awakened person may continue to engage lovingly with family members, but without the same investment in maintaining the family drama. This can be experienced by others as distance or coldness, when actually it's the emergence of genuine love freed from the distortions of need and manipulation. Watts often spoke about the need for compassion in these situations. The awakened person must recognize that others are doing the best they can with their current level of consciousness. There's no point in trying to force awakening on anyone or becoming frustrated when others don't see what you see. The only skillful approach is to embody the freedom you've discovered while remaining open and compassionate toward those who are still struggling. The loneliness of liberation. Despite the profound peace and freedom that awakening brings, there's often a dimension of loneliness that's rarely discussed in spiritual literature. It's not the loneliness of isolation. The awakened person may have many connections and relationships. It's more like the loneliness of having traveled to a distant country and come back to find that you can't quite convey what you experienced there. You want to share the beauty, the revelation, the utter obviousness of what you've seen, but the words fall flat. The explanations sound either too simple or too obscure. People nod politely, but you can see in their eyes that they haven't really understood. They've understood the words, perhaps, but not the reality the words are pointing toward. This loneliness is compounded by the fact that the awakened person can no longer participate fully in the shared narratives that bind people together. The collective complaints about how hard life is, the group anxieties about the future, the mutual reassurances and commiserations, all of these create a sense of belonging and shared identity, but they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding that the awakened person can no longer pretend to share. Watts himself was candid about experiencing this loneliness despite his public success. He could speak to thousands, could articulate the inarticulable with remarkable skill, could make people laugh and think and question. But at the end of the day, he was alone, with an understanding that couldn't be transferred, only pointed toward. The loneliness is particularly acute because the awakened person recognizes that there's nothing fundamentally different or special about them. They haven't achieved some extraordinary state that separates them from others. They've simply seen through an illusion that everyone is capable of seeing through. Yet most people remain caught in the illusion, and the awakened person can't reach back across that gap and pull them through. Each person must make the journey themselves. The wisdom of concealment. Given all these challenges and the envy and misunderstanding that awakening can provoke, many spiritual traditions have emphasized the wisdom of concealment. The Taoist sage appears ordinary, blending into society without drawing attention. The Zen master works in the garden alongside students without claiming any special status. The awakened person in our modern context might be the person at the office who seems unremarkably content, who doesn't get caught up in drama, who maintains a quiet presence that others find calming without quite knowing why. This concealment isn't about hiding or being inauthentic. It's about recognizing that broadcasting your awakening serves no useful purpose and often creates unnecessary complications. The awakened person has nothing to prove and no need for recognition. They're not collecting followers or building a spiritual identity. They're simply living naturally, and natural living doesn't call attention to itself. What's distinguished between genuine awakening and what he called spiritual materialism, the ego's tendency to co-opt spiritual insights and turn them into another form of achievement or superiority. The person who constantly talks about their awakening, who drops spiritual concepts into every conversation, who uses their understanding as a way to establish status over others, is demonstrating that the ego is still very much in charge. They're using spiritual awakening as the ego's new outfit, which is perhaps even more confining than the old one. The truly awakened person has nothing to prove because they've seen through the entire game of proving. They can let others think whatever they think. They can allow misunderstanding without feeling compelled to correct it. There's a deep relaxation into not being understood, not being recognized, not being appreciated for what they truly are. This relaxation itself is a sign of genuine freedom. Living the teaching Watts emphasized repeatedly that the deepest teaching isn't transmitted through words, but through presence. The awakened person teaches simply by being, by embodying a different quality of consciousness that others can feel even if they can't articulate what they're feeling. This embodied teaching is subtle and powerful. It doesn't convince the mind. In fact, the mind may remain skeptical or critical. But something in the presence of genuine awakening touches a deeper knowing in others. It plants a seed that may lie dormant for years before sprouting. It creates a crack in the consensus reality that can't quite be sealed up again. The envy that awakened presence triggers is actually a sign that this seed has been planted. The discomfort others feel isn't really about the awakened person at all. It's about their own intuition that another way of being is possible, combined with the fear or belief that this way isn't accessible to them. The envy is actually a form of recognition, however distorted and uncomfortable it may be. The awakened person's task, if there is one, is simply to remain present and authentic without apologizing for their freedom or attempting to diminish it to make others more comfortable. This isn't about being confrontational or provocative. It's about trusting that their natural being, freed from the distortions of ego, will have its own effect without them having to manage or control that effect. Watts spoke often about Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of effortless action or non-doing. The awakened person lives from this principle. They respond naturally to what arises without the overlay of strategic thinking about how to present themselves or what impact they should have. They trust the intelligence of consciousness itself to work through them in ways their limited personal mind couldn't orchestrate. The gift. Hidden in envy. Here's where we arrive at a surprising insight that Watts would certainly appreciate. The envy that awakened souls trigger in others is actually a gift in disguise. It's a signal, a message from the depths of consciousness saying, what you see in this person is actually pointing toward your own true nature. Every quality we envy in another exists because we recognize it, at least potentially, in ourselves. We can only perceive freedom, peace, authenticity, or any other quality because these are possibilities within our own consciousness. The envy is like a compass needle pointing toward home, if only we understood it correctly. The problem is that most people misinterpret this signal. Instead of recognizing the envy as evidence of their own awakening potential, they project it outward and resent the person who triggered it. They create a story about why that person has something they can't have. Better circumstances, more privilege, less responsibility, whatever explanation maintains their own sense of limitation. But the awakened person understands this dynamic with compassion. They recognize that the envy directed toward them is actually the beginning of a possible awakening in the other person. It's consciousness recognizing itself in disguised form. The question is whether the envious person will follow the signal back to its source in their own being, or whether they'll remain focused on the external trigger. This understanding allows the awakened person to receive others' envy without taking it personally or being hurt by it. They see it as part of the natural process of awakening happening in its own time and way in each person. They don't try to accelerate this process or explain it. They simply remain present, trusting that presence itself is the teaching. The deepening journey. Alan Watts was careful to emphasize that awakening isn't a final destination, but an ongoing deepening. The initial recognition that the separate self is illusory is just the beginning. Integrating this recognition into all areas of life, allowing it to inform relationships, work, creativity, and everyday activities. This is the real work, though work isn't quite the right word since it happens naturally rather than through effortful striving. As this integration deepens, the quality that triggers envy in others also evolves. Initially, the awakened person might still carry some subtle sense of having discovered something special, some faint spiritual ego, even if they're aware enough to be embarrassed about it. But as years pass and the recognition stabilizes, even this subtle self-consciousness drops away. What emerges is a quality of ordinariness that is itself extraordinary, not because it's special, but because it's so natural, so free of pretense, so undefended. This is the quality Watts embodied in his best moments and pointed toward in his teachings. It's not about becoming someone enlightened or awakened. It's about relaxing into being nobody in particular, which paradoxically allows you to be fully yourself. At this stage, the envy that the person triggers changes quality. It becomes less personal and more like a longing for home that the person evokes in others without trying. It's the recognition that sparks in people when they encounter someone who has remembered what everyone has forgotten, that we are, in our deepest nature, the eternal consciousness that is playing all the roles, dreaming all the dreams, living all the lives. The ultimate paradox. We arrive finally at the ultimate paradox that Watts loved to explore. The awakened person isn't really different from anyone else. There's no one there who is awakened. The separate self that everyone takes themselves to be is equally illusory, whether it's seen through or not. The only difference is that the awakening has been recognized in one case and not in the other. This means that the envy others direct toward the awakened person is really envy of themselves, of their own true nature that they haven't yet recognized. They're looking at their own freedom reflected in another and mistaking it for something that belongs to someone else. The awakened person knows this, which is why they can't take credit for their awakening or feel superior because of it. It's not an achievement, not an attainment, not something they did. It's what they are, what everyone is, beneath all the layers of identification and belief. This recognition brings a profound humility that has nothing to do with false modesty. The awakened person genuinely doesn't see themselves as special or different in any ultimate sense. They're just a particular expression of the one consciousness, playing a particular role in the cosmic drama, no more or less important than any other role. And yet, from the perspective of those still identified with their separate selves, they embody something profoundly different and threatening, the possibility that everything we think we know about who we are and what life is might be fundamentally mistaken. This possibility triggers envy, fear, fascination, and hostility in roughly equal measures. The awakened person's only response can be compassionate presence. They can't force recognition on anyone. They can't prove their understanding or convince others of anything. They can only be what they are, naturally and without apology, trusting that this naturalness itself plants seeds that will flower in their own time. Alan Watts passed away in 1973, but his voice continues to resonate across decades, reaching new generations of seekers. If he could speak directly to you now, watching this video wherever you are in the world, what might he say about the dynamics we've explored? Perhaps something like this. Don't be dismayed if your awakening, your growing consciousness of reality's true nature, creates difficulties in your social world. Don't be surprised if others react with confusion, discomfort, or even hostility. This is as natural as waves arising in the ocean. It's part of the process, part of the play. Remember that you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're not on a mission to awaken others or prove that your understanding is correct. These would just be more games of the ego, spiritual materialism in disguise. You're simply being what you are, naturally and without forcing. The envy you trigger in others is actually their own consciousness recognizing itself and not yet understanding what it's recognizing. Have compassion for this confusion. You were confused once too. We all are, in the great forgetting and remembering that is this cosmic game. Live lightly. Don't take your awakening too seriously. That would be just another form of ego. Don't use it to establish superiority or separation. Remember that the separate self was always illusory, whether it was seen through or not. You haven't become someone enlightened. You've simply recognized that no one was ever there to become anything. And in this recognition, live fully, love completely, engage with the world not as an enlightened being interacting with unenlightened ones, but as consciousness playing all the roles, experiencing itself from all perspectives. Every person you meet is yourself in disguise. Every situation is the universe presenting itself to itself. The loneliness will be there sometimes, the misunderstanding will continue, but so will the peace. the freedom, the profound humor of seeing through the cosmic joke. And gradually, naturally, without trying to make it happen, your presence will affect others, seeds will be planted, cracks will appear in the consensus reality. Not because you're doing anything special, but because consciousness recognizes itself and longs to remember what it truly is. This is enough. This has always been enough. Rest in this knowing and let life live itself through you. Thank you for joining this exploration of one of Alan Watts's most penetrating insights, the strange and difficult dynamics that arise when consciousness awakens to itself while surrounded by those still dreaming. If this resonated with you, please share it with others who might benefit from these teachings. And remember, wherever you are in the world, whatever your journey looks like, you are consciousness itself having a particular experience. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else is needed.